There's an old saying that the sunset years of life should be golden. Mine were anything but. My name is Margaret Foster, Maggie to those who know me, and at 72 years old, I found myself abandoned in a place I never thought I'd end up, a nursing home that smelled of industrial cleaner and old soup. Not the peaceful retirement I'd spent 40 years teaching elementary school children to save for. Not the dignified final chapter I deserved after raising a family and contributing to my community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning they left me here plays in my mind like a film I can't turn off. My son Daniel, always checking his watch, his wife Victoria's tight smile that never reached her eyes, and my grandchildren trailing behind, eyes glued to their phones. The way Daniel patted my hand with rehearsed reassurance. It's just temporary, Mom. Just until we figure out the next steps after selling the house. My house. The Craftsman-style home on Maple Avenue where I'd lived for 43 years. Where I'd raised Daniel and Susan. Where I'd nursed my Howard through cancer until he slipped away 5 years ago. Sold without my permission while I was still in the hospital recovering from my fall. The place was too big for you anyway, Victoria added, straightening her designer blazer. This is much more appropriate for someone your age. Appropriate. As if being 72 meant I should be grateful for a shared room with paper-thin walls, institutional food, and staff too overworked to learn my name. We've covered the first 3 months, Daniel explained, sliding the paperwork across the laminate desk to the facility director, Mrs. Simmons. We'll reassess after that. Reassess. Such a clinical word for deciding your mother's fate. That evening, after they'd gone, my son with a distracted kiss on my forehead, Victoria with a wave from the doorway, the grandchildren barely looking. Up from their devices, I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked around at what remained of my life. 2 suitcases, a box of photo albums, and my wedding ring. The rest had been sold, donated, or divided up among family members who suddenly developed an interest in my antiques. I didn't cry. Not then. The shock was too fresh, the betrayal too complete for tears. My roommate, an elderly woman named Eleanor, who rarely spoke except to complain, turned her back to me and increased the volume on her television. I stared out the window at the parking lot, watching as the last visitors of the day returned to their cars, heading home to houses, where people belonged. That first night at Whispering Pines Care Center, I lay awake wondering how I'd gone from being the matriarch of a family to an inconvenience to be managed. I'd always been the one others leaned on. The devoted wife, the nurturing mother, the dedicated teacher, the community volunteer. I'd poured myself into these roles, believing that love given freely would someday be returned. When Howard died, Daniel had insisted I keep the house. It's your home, Mom. Besides, where would we gather for holidays? Holidays. The last Thanksgiving before my fall, I'd cooked for 14 people despite my arthritis. Turkey, stuffing, 3 kinds of pie, including my famous apple pie that Howard always said could make a grown man cry. I'd sent everyone home with leftovers in containers I knew I'd never see again. 2 weeks later, Victoria had called asking if I could loan them money for Ethan's college fund. Daniel's investment didn't perform as expected, she'd explained. Just until the market recovers. You know how important education is. Of course I did. I'd been a teacher for 4 decades. I'd also helped pay for Daniel's business degree, co-signed the loan for their first house, and given them money for the down payment on their current home in Riverdale Heights. I'd never kept track of exactly how much. What mother tallies, what she gives her children? But looking back, it had been thousands. Tens of thousands. My retirement savings had dwindled, but I still had the house. The house that was now sold. Without my knowledge. While I recovered from a broken hip. Margaret? Margaret Foster? The voice pulled me from thoughts that had grown darker than the room. A silhouette stood in my doorway, illuminated from behind by the hallway's fluorescent lights. Yes? I'm Denise, night nurse. Just checking if you need anything before I finish my rounds. Nothing, thank you. What I needed couldn't be provided by the overworked staff of Whispering Pines. Well, if you change your mind, press that button. She pointed to the call button clipped to my bedsheet. Try to get some sleep. First night's always the hardest. As if the second would be any better. Or the third. Or however many I had left. The next morning, I ventured into what they optimistically called the community room. A space furnished with mismatched chairs, outdated magazines, and a television perpetually tuned to game shows. A handful of residents sat in various states of awareness. Some stared blankly at the TV, others dozed in their chairs. A few played cards at a corner table. I took a seat near the window, clutching the novel I'd brought along. I'd always found solace in books. Today, however, the words swam before my eyes, refusing to form coherent sentences. You're new. I looked up to find a woman about my age, regarding me with bright, alert eyes that seemed out of place in this atmosphere of resignation. She was small-boned with salt and pepper hair cut in a practical bob, and wore a bright scarf that added a defiant splash of color to the standard-issue sweatsuit many residents wore. I'm Irene Gonzalez, she continued, extending a hand adorned with several silver rings. Arrived 3 months ago after breaking my wrist. Was supposed to be temporary until I could manage on my own again. My daughter has other ideas. I shook her hand. Maggie Foster. Just arrived yesterday. Against your will, I'm guessing, judging by that look on your face. I was startled by her directness. Is it that obvious? Honey, I recognize the signs. Most of us didn't choose to be here. We were chosen for. There was something refreshing about her honesty. No platitudes about golden years or the best option. My son sold my house while I was in the hospital, I found myself saying. I owned that house outright. Howard and I paid off the mortgage 15 years ago. Irene's eyebrows rose. Could he legally do that? I sighed. I made him power of attorney after Howard died. For emergencies, I thought. Never imagined he'd consider selling my home an emergency. Ah, she nodded knowingly. The famous, it's for your own good emergency. Exactly. I was surprised by the bitter laugh that escaped me. Well, Maggie Foster, welcome to Limbo Acres, where we're all waiting for someone else to decide what happens next in our lives. She gestured around the room, though some of us are done waiting. Before I could ask what she meant, the loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing medication time. Irene stood. That's my cue. They get testy if you're late for your pills, even when you don't need them. Find me at lunch if you want the real orientation to this place, not the glossy brochure version your son probably got. I watched her walk away, her bright scarf like a flag of rebellion against the institutional drabness. Something about her energy kindled a spark in me, the first warmth I'd felt since arriving. True to her word, Irene found me at lunch, steering me away from the table of silent, despondent residents toward one occupied by 3 other people. Everyone, this is Maggie, fresh meat. She winked at me. Maggie, meet Frank, Dorothy, and Walter. Frank, a thin man with mischievous eyes, raised his spoon in salute. Dorothy, an elegant Asian American woman with perfect posture, nodded politely. Walter, distinguished with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, stood slightly and extended his hand. Welcome to our little corner of resistance, he said, his voice warm and cultured. Walter doesn't actually live here, Irene explained. He's a volunteer, reads to the residents, helps with activities. Former professor who apparently doesn't know how retirement is supposed to work. Emeritus Professor of English Literature, Walter corrected with a smile. And I find the company here far more interesting than my empty house. He's just saying that because Dorothy used to be a concert pianist and can discuss Chopin with him, Frank interjected. The rest of us just smile and nod. Dorothy rolled her eyes. Ignore Frank. He thinks being a former baseball coach gives him license to tease everyone. Former minor league player and coach, Frank corrected. I have standards. I found myself smiling genuinely for the first time since arriving. These people didn't fit my preconceived notion of nursing home residents. They were vibrant, engaged, and surprisingly funny. So, Maggie, Dorothy said, delicately cutting her overcooked chicken, what did you do before you were sentenced to Whispering Pines? I taught elementary school, 4th grade, for 40 years. A noble profession, Walter commented, shaping young minds. 35 years as a nurse for me, Irene added. Pediatric ward. We both worked with children, just different ends of the spectrum. I had 2 children of my own, I said. Daniel, who's the reason I'm here, and Susan, who lives in Portland. Haven't seen her in 3 years. Ah, the children who become strangers, Dorothy nodded. I have a similar situation with my son. Lives in Vancouver. Too busy to visit, never too busy to offer opinions on my care. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conversation continued, each person sharing pieces of their lives before Whispering Pines. I learned that Frank had been widowed twice. I'm what they call a slow learner. Dorothy had fled Vietnam as a child and gone on to play with major symphonies, and Irene had raised 3 children as a single mother after her husband left her for his secretary. The most cliché thing he ever did. By the time lunch ended, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in this place. A sense of connection. These weren't the vacant-eyed, passive residents I'd noticed when I first arrived. They were people with rich histories who refused to be defined by their current circumstances. As we left the dining room, Walter fell into step beside me. We're starting a writing workshop tomorrow, he said. Nothing fancy, just a chance to put thoughts on paper. You're welcome to join us. I'm not a writer, I demurred. Were you born a teacher? He asked with a gentle smile. Well, no. Then perhaps you weren't born a writer either, but might become one. 2:00 in the activity room, if you change your mind. He nodded politely and headed toward the main entrance, leaving me to consider his invitation. I'd never thought of myself as creative. Howard had been the storyteller in our family, spinning elaborate bedtime tales for Daniel and Susan that had them begging for just one more chapter, Dad. But what else did I have to do with my time now? That afternoon, my phone rang. The first call since I'd arrived. My heart leapt, hoping it might be Daniel checking how I was settling in. Instead, it was Susan, my daughter, calling from across the country. Mom? Ethan just texted me that you're in some nursing home? What the hell is going on? Susan's voice, which I hadn't heard in months except for brief birthday and Christmas calls, was sharp with concern and accusation. Daniel sold the house, I said simply. He what? He can't just sell your house. Apparently he can. Power of attorney. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. But that was for emergencies. For medical decisions if you couldn't make them. That's what I thought too. Where's all your stuff? Sold, donated, or distributed among relatives. I have 2 suitcases and my photo albums. Mom, I'm so sorry. Her voice cracked. I had no idea. Daniel just said you'd had a fall and they were helping you transition to somewhere with more support. That's one way of putting it, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. How bad was the fall? Are you okay? Broken hip. I'm healed now, just using a cane. Nothing that required selling my home from under me. And Whispering Pines? What's it like? I looked around at the beige walls, the thin curtain separating me from Eleanor, who was now snoring loudly. It's a place to exist, I said finally. Not to live. Another silence. Then, I need to talk to Daniel. This isn't right. Susan, don't get involved. You two already barely speak. That's not the point. This is about you, Mom. About what's right. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my lap, emotions warring within me. Part of me was touched by Susan's outrage on my behalf. Another part, worried about creating more family conflict. And a small, ashamed part of me felt vindicated that someone else saw the injustice in what had happened. That evening, Daniel called, his voice tight with controlled anger. Susan called you, I gather. She called me, yes. Mom, you know the house was too much for you. The stairs, the maintenance, you fell for God's sake. I fell getting the mail, Daniel. I could have fallen anywhere. Well, the decision's been made. The house is sold. The proceeds are in a trust for your care. A trust I can't access? His silence was answer enough. How much of my money have you and Victoria spent, Daniel? I asked quietly. What's that supposed to mean? His defensiveness told me everything. The college fund loan, the down payment on your house, the business investment 3 years ago. How much? That's different. That was family helping family. And this? Selling my home without my consent? What is this? He sighed, the sound of a man who considered himself deeply misunderstood. This is us making sure you're taken care of. I've got to go. Victoria and I have dinner plans. I'll visit on Sunday. He hung up before I could respond. I stared at the phone, wondering when exactly my son had become a stranger. When had the little boy who once brought me dandelions, because they're sunny like you, Mommy, transformed into this man who could dismiss me so easily? That night, sleep eluded me again. I lay awake listening to Eleanor's snores and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway. My mind replayed conversations from years past, searching for the moment when things changed. Was it when Howard died? When Victoria entered the picture? When I started saying yes to every request for financial help? The next morning, I found myself moving with purpose for the first time since arriving. I showered, dressed in one of the few decent outfits I still owned, and applied a touch of lipstick. If I was going to join a writing workshop, I wanted to look like someone who might have something worth saying. The activity room was brighter than other spaces in Whispering Pines, with large windows overlooking a small garden. About a dozen residents sat at tables arranged in a semicircle. Walter stood at the front, distributing notebooks and pens with the air of a man who took even volunteer work seriously. Ah, Maggie, wonderful to see you. His smile seemed genuinely pleased, as if my presence had made his day better. Please, take any seat. I chose a spot next to Irene, who nudged me approvingly. Good choice, she whispered. I was worried you might be a hider. A hider? Someone who retreats into their room and slowly disappears. Happens all the time here. Before I could respond, Walter called the group to attention. Welcome, everyone, to our first writing circle. I'm not here to teach you proper grammar or literary techniques. I'm here to help you find your voice, a voice that may have been silent for too long. Something in his words resonated within me. How long had it been since anyone had asked for my thoughts, my feelings, my stories? How long had I been seen as just an aging body to be managed, rather than a mind still full of ideas? We'll start. Simply, Walter continued. Today's prompt is, the thing most people don't understand about me is... Take 10 minutes to write whatever comes to mind. Don't worry about it being good. Just worry about it being true. I stared at the blank page before me. The thing most people don't understand about me. Where could I possibly begin? That despite my age, I still felt like the same person I was at 30? That being discarded by my son had broken something in me I wasn't sure could be repaired? That I was terrified of fading away in this place, forgotten by the world outside? Almost without realizing it, I began to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster, my hand struggling to keep pace with my thoughts. I wrote about feeling invisible, about the indignity of having others decide what was best for me, about the betrayal of finding myself in this place after a lifetime of caring for others. When Walter called time, I was surprised to find I'd filled nearly 2 pages. I hadn't written anything longer than a grocery list in years. "Would anyone like to share?" Walter asked. "No pressure. This is a safe space." To my surprise, Frank raised his hand. The former baseball player read a poignant piece about how people assumed his joking manner meant he didn't grieve deeply for his 2 wives. "They don't understand that I laugh because the alternative is to cry all day," he concluded. Dorothy shared next, her precise diction detailing how people saw only her accomplishments, never the sacrifices she'd made fleeing her homeland and abandoning her original name. When Irene raised her hand, I expected another confident statement. Instead, she read about her fear of being forgotten by her children, of becoming just an obligation they checked off their to-do lists. "The thing most people don't understand about me," she read, her voice uncharacteristically vulnerable, "is that being brave isn't the same as not being afraid. I'm afraid every day, of declining health, of losing my memories, of dying alone. I just don't let it stop me from living whatever life I have left." Her words struck a chord so deep within me that tears pricked at my eyes. I'd been devastated. By Daniel's betrayal, by finding myself in this place. But was I going to let that define whatever time I had remaining? "Maggie, would you like to share?" Walter's voice was gentle, without pressure. Before I could overthink it, I nodded and began to read. My voice shook at first, then steadied as I gave words to feelings I'd been suppressing since arriving at Whispering Pines. "The thing most people don't understand about me is that being 72 doesn't mean I'm finished. It doesn't mean I'm ready to be shelved like an outdated reference book. Inside this aging body is a mind still hungry for meaning, a heart still capable of breaking, and a spirit that refuses, absolutely refuses, to be grateful for being discarded." When I finished, the room was silent. Then Frank let out a low whistle. "Well, damn," he said. "Tell us how you really feel, teacher." A ripple of laughter broke the tension, and I found myself joining in, the release of emotion almost euphoric after days of numbness. Walter's eyes met mine with something like recognition. "Thank you, Maggie, for that truth. That's exactly what this circle is about, giving voice to the things we've kept silent." After the workshop ended, I felt different. Not happier exactly, but more present. As if I'd taken the first step on a journey whose destination wasn't yet clear. Walter approached as I was gathering my things. "Your writing has power, Maggie, raw and honest. I've never thought of myself as a writer. Most writers don't, until they write something that resonates with others. Would you consider sharing more at our next session?" "I'll think about it," I promised, oddly touched by his faith in words I hadn't known I could produce. As I left the activity room, my phone rang again. Susan's number flashed on the screen. "Mom, I've been doing some research," she said without preamble. "I talked to a lawyer friend about the power of attorney and the house sale. And there might be grounds to challenge it, especially if you weren't mentally incapacitated when the decision was made. Were you?" "No, I had a broken hip, not a broken brain." That's what I thought. I also found out something interesting about Daniel's finances. I sank onto a bench in the hallway, suddenly needing to sit down. "What about them?" "His investment firm is under investigation for mismanagement. Several clients have filed complaints. He could be facing serious professional consequences." The pieces began to click into place. The increasing frequency of Daniel's requests for loans, Victoria's designer clothes that always seemed to be new, the private schools for the children despite complaints about tight budgets. "He's been using my money to maintain appearances," I said slowly. And now the house? Probably, Susan confirmed. Mom, I want to help fix this, but I need to know what you want. Do you want to fight this legally? Do you want to confront Daniel? What's your ideal outcome here? It was the first time in years, perhaps decades, that someone had asked what I wanted rather than telling me what I needed. The question caught me off guard. I don't know yet, I admitted. I need time to think. Take all the time you need. I've booked a flight for next weekend. We can talk then. You're coming here? My voice cracked with surprise. Of course I am. You're my mother, and you've been wronged. I should have been checking in more often. I'm sorry for that. After we hung up, I remained on the bench, processing this unexpected turn of events. Susan was coming. My finances might not be as irrevocably lost as I'd feared. And most importantly, I'd found my voice again, not just with family, but through words on a page that had resonated with others. For the first time since arriving at Whispering Pines, I felt a glimmer of something that felt dangerously like hope. One phone call had changed everything, not just because of what Susan might be able to do legally, but because it reminded me that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. As I walked back to my room, I passed the community board where Walter had posted a sign-up sheet for the next writing circle. Without hesitation, I wrote my name at the top of the list. Eleanor glanced up briefly as I entered our shared room, then returned to her TV show. But this time, the small space didn't feel quite so much like a prison cell. It was just a room, a temporary situation, not the final chapter of my story. I opened the notebook Walter had provided and began to write again. Not because I was assigned a prompt, but because I suddenly had things to say. About justice, about reclaiming power, about finding unexpected allies in a place designed for the forgotten. The phone call from Susan had changed everything, yes. But perhaps the most important change was happening within me. A spark reigniting. In a spirit I had almost allowed to be extinguished. In the days following Susan's call, I moved through Whispering Pines with new awareness. The facility hadn't changed. The same beige walls, the same overcooked food, the same understaffed care team rushing between rooms. But my perception had shifted. I began to notice details I'd been too numb to see before. How some staff members treated residents with genuine kindness, while others spoke in the exaggerated high-pitched tones one might use with a toddler. How some residents, like Eleanor, had surrendered to this place completely, while others, like Irene and her friends, carved out small domains of dignity and autonomy. I started joining Irene for morning coffee in the small courtyard when weather permitted. Despite the November chill, she insisted on getting some real air, not the recycled garbage they pump through the vents. "You're different," she observed one morning, studying me over her steaming cup. "Something's changed." "My daughter called," I told her. "She's coming to visit. She thinks there might be legal issues with how Daniel sold my house." Irene's eyebrows shot up. Well, Mama Bear's got a cub coming to the rescue." "Susan and I haven't been close in years," I admitted. "I'm not sure why she's suddenly so concerned." "Does it matter? Take the ally, Maggie. In this place, you grab onto help wherever it appears." I mulled this over. "I'm not used to being helped. I've always been the one other people relied on." "And look where that got you," Irene said, not unkindly. "Maybe it's time to let someone else do the heavy lifting for a change." Her words stayed with me throughout the day, through a bland lunch and an uninspiring group exercise session where we tossed a foam ball back and forth. Had my lifetime habit of self-sufficiency, of never asking for help, contributed to my current situation? Had I made it too easy for people to take advantage of my generosity while expecting nothing in return? Sunday arrived, and with it, Daniel's promised visit. I waited in the visitor's lounge, dressed in my best remaining outfit, a navy blue dress that Howard had always liked, and sensible but polished shoes. If I was going to confront my son, I wanted to look like someone deserving of respect, not a fragile old woman to be managed. Daniel arrived 30 minutes late, alone. I had expected Victoria and the grandchildren, but he explained they were tied up with a school project of Ethan's. "How are you settling in, Mom?" he asked, kissing my cheek perfunctorily. "The staff? Treating you well? As well as can be expected in a place you're paying minimal rates for," I replied, my tone sharper than I'd intended. He winced. "Mom, we've been over this. Your care is expensive and the trust from the house sale needs to last." "About that trust," I began, determined to maintain my composure. "Susan tells me there might be legal questions about your use of the power of attorney to sell the house." Daniel's expression hardened. "Susan? Since when does she care about family matters? She's been absent for years." "She's coming to visit next weekend." "To what end? To stir up trouble?" "Mom, everything I've done has been for your benefit. You weren't safe living alone anymore. That wasn't your decision to make. Someone had to make it. You weren't being realistic about your limitations." I took a deep breath. "Daniel, how much of my money have you and Victoria spent over the years?" His face flushed. "Is that what this is about? After everything we've done for you, you're tallying up what we owe?" "I'm simply asking for transparency about my own finances." "Your finances are being managed in a trust for your care," he said stiffly. "That's all you need to know. A trust you control. And Susan mentioned your firm is under investigation?" Daniel's flush deepened to an angry red. "She had no right to tell you that. It's a temporary situation, completely overblown. Some clients made risky investments against my advice and are now looking for someone to blame. I studied my son, trying to reconcile this defensive, evasive man with the child I had raised to value honesty above all else." "Are you in financial trouble, Daniel?" "My finances are none of your concern," he snapped. Then, seeming to realize his tone, he softened slightly. "Look, Mom, I know this transition has been difficult. Change always is at your age. But Whispering Pines is a perfectly adequate facility with all the care you need. The house was an unnecessary expense. The house was my home, paid for, mine. And the proceeds are providing for your care. That's what matters." We reached an impasse, both of us unwilling to concede. The remainder of his visit was strained, filled with uncomfortable small talk about the grandchildren's activities and Victoria's latest charity committee. When he stood to leave after barely an hour, I felt a mixture of relief and profound sadness. "I'll try to visit again in a couple of weeks," he said, already checking his phone for messages. "Victoria sends her love." I doubted that very much, but nodded. "Please give my love to Ethan and Emily. Tell them their grandmother would love to see them sometime. Of course, they're just busy with school and activities. You know how it is." As he walked away, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The son I had sacrificed for, the family I had supported financially and emotionally for years, they saw me as nothing more than an obligation now, a problem to be solved with minimal investment of time or genuine care. Back in my room, Eleanor was watching a game show, the volume high enough to discourage conversation. I changed out of my good dress, carefully hanging it in the small closet that now contained my entire wardrobe. As I did, I noticed the notebook from Walter's writing group, where I'd continued to jot down thoughts in the evenings. I picked it up, flipping through the pages filled with my increasingly confident handwriting. In those pages, I'd poured out my hurt, my anger, my confusion at finding myself so thoroughly discarded. But I'd also begun to explore other emotions: appreciation for my new friends at Whispering Pines, curiosity about what Walter might think of my latest paragraph, hope for what Susan's visit might bring. The next morning, I made a decision. After breakfast, I approached Raymond Washington, the activities coordinator, a kind-faced young man who always seemed genuinely interested in the residents' well-being. Ray, I'd like to start a book club, I announced, for residents who can still read independently. Nothing too demanding, just a monthly discussion. He looked momentarily surprised, then pleased. That's a great idea, Mrs. Foster. We've tried something similar before, but never had a resident willing to lead it. I taught literature to fourth graders for 40 years, I said. I think I can handle a group of seniors. Ray laughed. I have no doubt. Let me check with administration, but I don't foresee any issues. We could announce it at lunch today if you'd like. Perfect. And Ray, please call me Maggie. That small request, to be addressed by my preferred name rather than a formal title that reduced me to my marital status, felt surprisingly significant. A tiny reclamation of identity in a place designed to process residents rather than see them as individuals. At lunch, I sat with Irene, Frank, and Dorothy, sharing my book club idea and Daniel's disappointing visit. So he stonewalled you about the money, Frank summarized. Typical. My son tried the same thing when he borrowed my car and sold it. Claimed he was managing my assets since I couldn't drive anymore. What did you do? I asked. Frank's eyes twinkled. Told him I'd be sharing some colorful stories about his teenage years at the next family reunion unless my car miraculously reappeared. Amazing how that worked. Dorothy shook her head. Not all of us have such leverage, Frank. My son simply stopped visiting when I questioned his financial decisions regarding my late husband's business. That's the threat they all use, Irene observed. Comply or we'll abandon you, as if we haven't already been abandoned in this glorified storage facility. Whispering Pines isn't that bad, I said automatically, then caught myself. Actually, it is, but we don't have to let it define us. Says the woman starting a book club, Irene teased, but her tone was approving. Walter joined us, setting down his tray with a smile. What's this about a book club? Maggie's taking over the place, Frank announced. Next thing you know, she'll be running for resident council president. The idea, meant as a joke, planted a seed in my mind. I'd been on the PTA board, had served as department head at my school. I understood committees, governance, the power of organized voices. Perhaps there was more I could do here than simply adjust to my circumstances. After lunch, Ray made the announcement about the book club, and to my surprise, 12 residents signed up immediately. Some I recognized from Walter's writing group, others were unfamiliar faces eager for intellectual engagement. What should our first book be? Asked a gentleman named Gerald, who introduced himself as a retired high school principal. A coincidence. That made me think of Howard with a pang. Something with teeth, suggested a woman named Louise, who walked with 2 canes but whose eyes were sharp behind thick glasses. Nothing patronizing. I'm tired of being treated like my brain stopped working when my knees did. We settled on The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, a thoughtful exploration of duty, regret, and the passing of time that seemed fitting for our demographic. Ray promised to order copies, looking slightly surprised but pleased by our ambition. The rest of the week passed in a blur of small but meaningful activities. I attended Walter's writing group again, this time sharing a piece about Howard and the life we'd built together. I joined Irene for her self-organized, real, walking group that circled the facility's perimeter rather than shuffling through hallways. I even volunteered to help a partially blind resident named Ruth write letters to her grandchildren. By the time Friday arrived, I felt more like myself than I had since before my fall. I was still angry about my circumstances, still determined to understand what had happened to my finances, but I was no longer simply a passive recipient of care. I was Maggie Foster, a woman with skills, opinions, and a growing circle of allies. Susan's flight was scheduled to arrive in the afternoon. She had texted that she would come directly to Whispering Pines from the airport, and I found myself growing increasingly nervous as the hour approached. It had been 3 years since we'd seen each other in person. Our phone conversations, while cordial, had been infrequent and often superficial. Would she recognize the mother she remembered? Would I recognize the daughter who had moved across the country and built a life separate from our family? I waited in the main lobby, ignoring Eleanor's complaints about the change in our room's television schedule. Every few minutes, I smoothed my hair or adjusted my blouse, aware that I was seeking Susan's approval in a way I never had with Daniel. Perhaps because she had always been the more discerning of my children, quicker to notice details, less easily satisfied with explanations that didn't quite add up. At precisely 4 o'clock, the automatic doors slid open, and there she was. Susan had always resembled Howard more than me, tall and angular where I was petite, with her father's serious eyes and analytical expression, but there was something different about her now. A softness around the edges, a tentative smile that reminded me of the little girl who used to hide behind my skirts when meeting strangers. "Mom," she said simply, crossing the lobby in a few long strides. I stood, suddenly uncertain. We had never been a demonstrative family, especially after the children reached adolescence. But Susan surprised me by pulling me into a tight hug, one that conveyed more emotion than words could have managed. "You look good," she said, stepping back to examine me. "I was worried after what you told me, but you seem stronger than I expected." "I am stronger than I expected," I admitted. "It's been a challenging few weeks, but I'm finding my way." She nodded, a flicker of regret crossing her features. "I should have been here sooner. When Daniel said you needed more care, I just assumed I didn't question." "It's all right," I said, though part of me wanted to agree, to ask why she hadn't checked on her mother's situation more thoroughly. But recriminations wouldn't help us move forward. "You're here now." I gave her a tour of Whispering Pines, the community room, the dining hall, the small library with its outdated paperbacks, and finally, my shared room with Eleanor, who acknowledged Susan with a curt nod before returning to her television program. "This is where they put you?" Susan asked quietly, taking in the narrow bed, the single nightstand, the thin partition that offered minimal privacy. "After selling a 3-bedroom house in one of the city's best neighborhoods?" "Whispering Pines isn't the Four Seasons," I said dryly. "But it's the accommodations the trust apparently allows for." Susan's expression hardened. "We need to talk about that trust, Mom, and about a lot of other things. Is there somewhere private we can go?" The visitors' lounge was occupied by a large family celebrating a resident's birthday, but Ray offered us the use of the small conference room normally reserved for staff meetings. "Take as long as you need, Maggie," he said with a smile that acknowledged our new first-name basis. It's good to see family connections being maintained. Once we were seated in the modest conference room, Susan pulled out a folder filled with papers. "I've been doing research since we spoke," she began without preamble, "and consulting with a lawyer friend who specializes in elder law. What Daniel did, selling your house using the power of attorney while you were temporarily incapacitated, but not mentally compromised, is legally questionable at best." "What does that mean practically?" I asked. "It means we might be able to challenge the sale, or at least force transparency about the proceeds and how they're being managed. But before we go down that road, I need to understand the bigger picture." She hesitated. "Mom, how much money have you given Daniel over the years?" It was the same question I'd asked Daniel, but coming from Susan, it felt less confrontational and more practical. "I never kept precise records," I admitted. "It started small, helping with the down payment on their first house, contributing to the grandchildren's education funds. But after Howard died, the requests became more frequent and larger. Business investments, home renovations, that trip to Europe they said was essential for Daniel's networking." Susan nodded, making notes. "And all of this came from what sources? Your retirement savings? Home equity?" "Both. Howard and I had decent pensions from the school district, and his life insurance paid off the remaining mortgage." but I withdrew from my IRA several times for Daniel's emergencies. The last major one was a business investment 3 years ago, $50,000 that he said would pay off significantly. Susan's pen paused mid-note. 3 years ago? That's when his firm started having problems, according to what I found online. There have been complaints filed with regulatory agencies about mismanagement of client funds, improper investment, advice, even allegations of commingling personal and client assets. The implications settled over me slowly, like a heavy blanket. You think he used my money to cover losses at his firm? I think it's a possibility we need to consider. There's more, Mom. I checked county records online. Do you know what your house sold for? I shook my head. Daniel never told me the exact figure, just that it was enough to provide for my care. $475,000, Susan said, in a neighborhood where similar properties were selling for over $600,000. The room seemed to tilt slightly. That's not possible. The Petersons' house down the street sold for $625,000 last year, and it was smaller than ours. Exactly. And guess who bought your house for this bargain price? A company called Riverdale, Heights Development LLC. Care to know who the primary stakeholder is in that company? My stomach clenched. Victoria. Susan nodded grimly. Victoria's father, Thomas Parker, is listed as the managing member, but Victoria is a significant shareholder. They essentially bought your house from themselves, using Daniel's power of attorney at well below market value. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that for a moment I couldn't speak. This wasn't just Daniel making poor financial decisions or prioritizing his family's needs over mine. This was deliberate fraud perpetrated against his own mother. What do we do? I finally asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. That depends on what you want, Mom. We could file a legal challenge to the sale, report Daniel's actions to the authorities, or negotiate privately for a more equitable arrangement. She paused. Or we could do nothing, if that's what you prefer. Do nothing? After what they've done? Susan reached across the table and took my hand. Some people in your position might prioritize family peace over justice. I wouldn't blame you if that's your choice. I thought about Daniel's visit, his defensive posture, his clear assumption that I would accept whatever crumbs of attention and care he deigned to provide. I thought about Victoria's dismissive attitude, the grandchildren's disinterest, the years of financial support I'd provided without question or condition. I want what's rightfully mine, I said firmly. Not to punish Daniel, but because I deserve to control my own future, to live with dignity on the resources Howard and I worked our entire lives to secure. Susan squeezed my hand. I hoped you'd say that. Here's what I propose. For the next hour, we discussed strategy. Susan had already identified an elder law attorney in Riverdale willing to take my case on contingency, believing the evidence of malfeasance was strong enough to warrant pursuit. We would request all financial records related to the house sale, Daniel's power of attorney actions, and the trust supposedly established for my care. Depending on what we found, we could pursue either criminal charges or civil remedies. The goal isn't to see Daniel in jail, Susan clarified. It's to recover as much of your assets as possible and establish your independent control over them. And what about Whispering Pines? I asked. Even if we succeed, I'm not sure I could return to independent living immediately. One step at a time, Susan advised. First, we secure your finances. Then we explore better living arrangements. Perhaps an assisted living facility with private apartments, or a retirement community with graduated care options. The possibilities unfolded before me. A space of my own again, control over my daily schedule, the dignity of managing my own money. But another thought nagged at me. Why are you doing this, Susan? We've barely spoken in years. She looked down, at the papers spread between us, then met my eyes directly. When Daniel told me you'd had a fall and needed more care, I accepted his version of events. I told myself you were being looked after, that his family was geographically closer and better positioned to handle things. I was busy with my own life, my own problems. She took a breath. Then Ethan posted that photo of you in this place, looking so lost, and something didn't add up. The mom I remembered would never have agreed to a shared room in a facility like this. So I started asking questions. And the more answers I got, the more I realized I'd failed you. We all failed you, but I should have known better. I remembered how Dad always said you were the family's backbone, the one who solved everyone's problems and never complained about your own. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them back. Howard said that? All the time. He worried about what would happen to you if he went first, because you'd spent your life taking care of everyone else. He made me promise to look out for you if anything happened to him. Her voice cracked slightly. I broke that promise, Mom. But I'm here now, and I'm going to make it right. The emotion that washed over me was complex. Grief for Howard, who had worried for me even as he was dying. Disappointment in Susan for her years of distance, gratitude for her present determination to help, and a strange, unexpected relief at having someone else shoulder some of the burden I'd carried alone. For so long. We'll make it right together, I said finally. I'm not the same passive woman Daniel and Victoria thought they could tuck away and forget. I've changed, even in these few weeks. Susan studied me with new respect. I can see that. There's something different about you, Mom. A kind of steel that wasn't there before. Or maybe it was always there and I just never noticed. Our conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock. Ray opened the door slightly. Sorry to disturb you, Maggie, but it's almost dinner time, and Susan is welcome to join us as your guest. Thank you, Ray. We'll be right there. As we gathered our papers, Susan looked thoughtful. You seem to have made some connections here, despite everything. I have, I acknowledged. There are good people at Whispering Pines, both staff and residents. They've helped me find my voice again. In the dining hall, I introduced Susan to Irene, Frank, Dorothy, and Walter, who had joined our table as he often did during his volunteer hours. Their warm welcome and sharp conversation clearly surprised my daughter, who had perhaps expected a room full of disengaged seniors eating in silence. Your mother is quite the revolutionary, Irene informed Susan over bland chicken casserole. Started a book club, joined the writing group, and rumor has it she's planning to run for resident council. I've only mentioned it as a possibility, I protested, though the idea had indeed been taking shape in my mind. Walter smiled. Sometimes the most effective revolutions start quietly, with small acts of self-determination. That's exactly what we were discussing, Susan said, glancing at me. Acts of self-determination. After dinner, Susan prepared to leave for her hotel, promising to return in the morning to continue our planning. As we walked to the entrance, she paused. Mom, I owe you an apology for more than just the recent situation. I've kept my distance these past few years, told myself it was because of the cross-country move, my divorce, starting a new career. But the truth is, I was avoiding the responsibility of being your daughter. It was easier to let Daniel handle everything, to convince myself you were fine with our occasional phone calls. We both could have done better, I said, recognizing the truth in her words but also my own role in our estrangement. I had always been closer to Daniel, had perhaps unconsciously made Susan feel less essential to my life. But we're here now. She hugged me again, this time with a fierceness that reminded me of her childhood embraces. We are. And tomorrow, we start fighting back. As I watched her walk to her rental car, a strange calm settled over me. The day's revelations should have left me devastated. The scale of Daniel and Victoria's betrayal was far greater than I had imagined. Instead, I felt oddly liberated. The truth, however painful, had brought clarity. I knew what I was facing now, and more importantly, I knew I wasn't facing it alone. Back in my room, I opened my notebook and began to write, not about anger or betrayal this time, but about hope. About the daughter who had returned, the new friends who had shown me I still had value, and the strength I was discovering in myself. Strength I would need for the battle ahead. Because make no mistake, it would be a battle. Daniel wouldn't surrender control of my assets easily, especially if his financial situation was as precarious as it appeared. Victoria would fight tooth and nail to protect the house purchase that had so clearly benefited her family. They would use every emotional weapon in their arsenal: guilt, family obligation, my supposed mental decline, to maintain the status quo. But they would be fighting a different Maggie Foster than the one they had deposited at Whispering Pines. This Maggie understood her worth, had allies both old and new, and possessed a clarity of purpose that comes only after facing one's deepest fears. Let them come, I thought as I wrote. I'm ready. I awoke early Sunday morning with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my teaching days. Susan would be arriving at 10, bringing the elder law attorney she had mentioned. We'd agreed that a direct legal approach was necessary given what we'd discovered about the house sale. The anxiety I might have felt was overshadowed by determination, a steely resolve that surprised me with its intensity. Eleanor was still asleep. Her breathing labored from the cold she'd been fighting all week. I dressed quietly, choosing my most professional-looking outfit, a burgundy sweater set and gray slacks that Howard had always said made me look distinguished. The clothing choices at Whispering Pines were limited, what could be hung in half a closet and stored in 3 small drawers. But I had insisted on bringing a few pieces that made me feel like myself, not just an interchangeable resident in elastic waist pants. The facility was quiet at 7 a.m. on a Sunday. I made my way to the small parlor near the entrance, a room rarely used except for the occasional family meeting with administration. Ray had arranged for us to use it today, another small kindness that reminded me not everyone in this place saw residents as burdens. Irene found me there, nursing a cup of coffee I'd smuggled from the dining room before official breakfast service. "Plotting the revolution already?" she asked, settling into the armchair opposite mine. "Legal strategy meeting," I corrected. "Susan is bringing an attorney." Irene's eyebrows rose. "Getting serious then. Good for you." She studied me for a moment. "You know they'll fight dirty, right? Your son and his wife? They'll try to make you look incompetent, unstable. It's the first play in the elder abuse handbook." Her bluntness was jarring but not unwelcome. "Probably, but they've underestimated me. And Susan." "Family allegiances can shift quickly when money's involved," Irene warned. "I've seen it more times than I can count, working in healthcare all those years. Just be prepared." "I am," I assured her, though her warning sent a small tremor of unease through me. Would Daniel really try to question my mental competence? Would he go that far to protect himself? Irene patted my hand. "You've got friends here, Maggie. Whatever happens, remember that." Her words warmed me more than she could know. After she left to join the early breakfast crowd, I remained in the parlor, watching the weak November sunlight creep across the worn carpet. My thoughts drifted to Howard and what he would think of our current situation. He had always trusted Daniel implicitly, proud of our son's ambition and apparent success. But Howard had also taught ethics at the high school level for years, drilling into students that character revealed itself most clearly when no one was watching. What would he make of Daniel's actions now? At precisely 10 o'clock, Susan arrived with a trim, silver-haired woman carrying a leather portfolio. My daughter's expression was determined, though I could detect the tension in the set of her shoulders. "Mom, this is Judith Barnett. She's the elder law specialist I mentioned." The attorney extended her hand with a warm smile. "Mrs. Foster, it's a pleasure to meet you. Susan has told me about your situation, and I believe we have several viable options to pursue. Please call me Maggie, I said, returning her handshake firmly. And thank you for coming on a Sunday. Elder abuse doesn't take weekends off, unfortunately, Judith replied, taking a seat at the small table. And what we're dealing with here appears to be financial exploitation, which falls squarely within that category. The term elder abuse struck me like a physical blow. I had never considered myself a victim of abuse. Betrayal, yes. Disrespect, certainly. But abuse carried connotations of helplessness I wasn't ready to accept. Judith must have read my expression. The legal definition includes financial exploitation of seniors, which is precisely what appears to have happened here. Using it gives us additional legal tools to address the situation. For the next hour, Judith outlined our options, explaining them in clear terms without the condescension some professionals adopt when speaking to older clients. The most straightforward approach would be to challenge Daniel's use of the power of attorney in selling my house, particularly given the clear conflict of interest in selling to a company his wife partially owned. The fact that the sale price was significantly below market value strengthens our position, Judith explained. And if we can prove the proceeds aren't being used primarily for your benefit, we have grounds for both civil action and potentially criminal charges. I don't want Daniel to go to jail, I interjected. I want accountability, not vengeance. Judith nodded. Most of my clients feel the same way. Our goal would be restitution first, with criminal charges as leverage if necessary. She slid a document across the table. This is a revocation of the power of attorney you granted Daniel. Signing this is our first step. It won't undo past actions, but it prevents him from making further financial decisions on your behalf. I read through the document carefully, then signed without hesitation. The simple act of revoking Daniel's authority felt unexpectedly emotional. A declaration of independence, a reclaiming of agency that had been too freely given away. What happens next? I asked. We'll file a petition with the court challenging the house sale and requesting a full accounting of the trust supposedly established for your care. We'll also seek temporary injunctive relief to freeze the remaining assets until the court makes a determination. Susan, who had been taking notes throughout, looked up. How quickly can this happen? I'll file the emergency petition tomorrow morning. Given the circumstances, we should get a hearing within a week or two. In the meantime, Judith turned to me, you should prepare for Daniel's reaction when he receives the legal notice. A knot formed in my stomach. He won't take it. Well? Few people do when confronted with financial misconduct, Judith agreed. Do you feel safe here at Whispering Pines if he becomes angry or confrontational? The question caught me off guard. Did I feel safe? Daniel had never been physically aggressive, but I'd also never directly challenged him in this way before. I think so, I said slowly. The staff here are attentive, and I have friends who look out for me. Nevertheless, I recommend informing the administration about the situation. They should be aware that family dynamics may become tense and that Daniel no longer has legal authority to make decisions for you. After Judith left with our signed documents, Susan stayed behind, concern etched on her face. Are you sure about this, Mom? Once we file these papers, there's no going back. Daniel will see it as a declaration of war. I considered her question carefully. If it were just about the money, even the house, I might hesitate. But this isn't just about assets. It's about my autonomy, my right to determine my own future. Daniel made decisions that affected every aspect of my life without consulting me, treating me like an incompetent child rather than his mother. That requires a response. Susan nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. I need to head back to Portland tomorrow evening, but I've arranged to work remotely for the next few weeks so I can come back for the hearing. And I'll call every day until then. You have your own life, Susan. Your job, your friends, and my mother, she interrupted firmly. Dad made me promise to look out for you, remember? Besides, I think I need this as much as you do. A chance to make things right. After Susan left, I made my way to the dining hall for lunch, feeling oddly lighter despite the confrontation looming ahead. The simple act of taking concrete steps, of pushing back against the narrative that had been imposed on me was revitalizing. Walter was at our usual table, deep in conversation with Dorothy about a piece of classical music he'd brought for the afternoon listening session. He looked up as I approached, his expression brightening. "Maggie, we missed you at breakfast." Dorothy was just explaining why Chopin's nocturnes are superior to his more celebrated works. "A nuanced argument wasted on Frank," Dorothy said dryly, nodding toward Frank, who was focused intently on his soup. "I appreciate music just fine," Frank protested. "I just appreciate food more when it's in front of me. Besides, my hearing aids don't do justice to Chopin." I settled into my seat, grateful for the normalcy of their banter after the weight of the morning's legal discussions. "You look different," Walter observed. "More settled somehow." "I'm taking back control of my life," I said simply. "Starting with legal action against my son for selling my house." Frank whistled low. "That's going to make for an awkward Thanksgiving." "Thanksgiving is already awkward when your family has deposited you in a care facility against your will," Dorothy pointed out. "Maggie is simply ensuring the discomfort flows in both directions." "It's not about making Daniel uncomfortable," I clarified. "It's about justice and establishing that I'm still capable of making my own decisions." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "The best revolutions aren't about revenge, but about restoration. Returning power to where it rightfully belongs." "Are you going to run for resident council with that kind of talk?" Frank teased. "Or for Congress?" The idea of the resident council resurfaced in my mind. "Actually, I am considering the council. This place needs changes, and sitting around, complaining won't accomplish anything." "What sorts of changes?" Walter asked, seeming genuinely interested. I hadn't fully articulated my thoughts before, but they flowed now with surprising clarity. "For starters, more input from residents on activities and meal planning. Better communication between staff and residents. Maybe even a committee to welcome newcomers and help them adjust, something I certainly could have used." "You've got my vote," Dorothy declared. "The current council is more concerned with planning bingo nights than addressing quality of life issues." "The election isn't for another 3 months," Frank pointed out. "Plenty of time to build your platform." "And your campaign team," Walter added with a smile that carried more warmth than casual friendliness might warrant. The rest of Sunday passed quietly. I joined the afternoon music appreciation session Walter had organized, finding unexpected solace in Chopin's melancholy nocturnes. Later, I attended a non-denominational service in the small chapel, not out of particular religious conviction but for the sense of community it provided. Throughout these activities, I found myself noticing details I might have overlooked before: how the music affected different residents, the small kindnesses staff members showed despite being overworked, the subtle social hierarchies that existed even in this ostensibly egalitarian environment. Monday morning brought a staff meeting that delayed breakfast, leaving residents milling about in hallways or returning to their rooms to wait. I was sitting in the community room, reviewing notes for the book club meeting scheduled for that afternoon when Patricia Simmons, the facility director, approached. "Mrs. Foster, could I speak with you in my office?" Her tone was professional, but with an undercurrent of tension that immediately put me on alert. "Of course." Mrs. Simmons' office was a small space near the entrance, decorated with generic, motivational posters and family photos I suspected were displayed more for visitors' benefit than personal enjoyment. She gestured for me to sit in the visitor's chair across from her desk. "I received a concerning call this morning from your son Daniel," she began, folding her hands on the desk. "He mentioned you might be experiencing some confusion about your financial situation and legal arrangements." The condescending phrasing, so careful, so deliberately constructed to undermine, ignited a slow burn of anger in my chest. Did he now? He explained that you've been upset about the sale of your house, which he assures me was necessary for your care. He's concerned that you might be manipulated by outside parties who don't understand your needs. By outside parties? I assume he means my daughter Susan. Mrs. Simmons's slight hesitation confirmed my suspicion. He didn't name anyone specifically, but he wanted me to know that as your designated responsible party and the trustee of your care fund, he should be consulted about any significant decisions regarding your welfare or finances. I took a deep breath, conscious of the need to appear calm and rational. Mrs. Simmons, I appreciate your concern. However, as of yesterday, Daniel is no longer my power of attorney. I've revoked that authority through legal channels. Her carefully composed expression flickered. I wasn't aware of that change. You'll receive official notification soon, I imagine. In the meantime, I want to be absolutely clear. Daniel does not speak for me. He does not make decisions for me. And any discussions about my care or finances should be directed to me personally. Mrs. Foster, these situations can be complicated. They certainly can, I interrupted, especially when they involve potential financial exploitation of seniors. My attorney believes that's precisely what has occurred in my case. The mention of an attorney visibly shifted something in Mrs. Simmons's demeanor. She straightened, adopting a more formal tone. I see. Well, of course, Whispering Pines respects our residents' legal rights. We'll need documentation of the power of attorney revocation for our files. You'll have it by tomorrow, I assured her. In the meantime, I'd like to request that any visits from Daniel be supervised by staff until the legal situation is resolved. This clearly wasn't a request she'd anticipated. Supervised visits? That's usually reserved for cases where there's concern about physical safety or severe emotional distress. My concern is that Daniel may attempt to pressure me into rescinding legal actions or make statements that could be construed as threats to my continued residency here. I'd prefer to have a witness present. Mrs. Simmons hesitated, then nodded slowly. We can arrange that, though I hope you understand this puts the staff in a somewhat awkward position. No more awkward than the position I found myself in when I discovered my house had been sold without my knowledge or consent, I replied evenly. As I left her office, I felt an unexpected surge of confidence. The old Maggie would have deferred to authority, would have allowed Mrs. Simmons to dictate the terms of the conversation. This new Maggie, forged in the crucible of betrayal and abandonment, demanded respect rather than hoping to receive it. I headed directly to Ray's office, finding him sorting through craft supplies for the afternoon art therapy session. Maggie! Just the person I wanted to see. What do you think about mosaic picture frames for Thursday's project? Too ambitious? Not at all. Most of us still have functioning hands, even if our children think otherwise. He glanced up at my tone. Everything okay? I just had an interesting conversation with Mrs. Simmons. It seems my son is already attempting to undermine my credibility. Ray set down the craft materials, giving me his full attention. That was fast. What happened? I explained the morning's events, including my request for supervised visits. Ray's expression grew increasingly concerned. That kind of situation can get messy fast, he observed. Families don't always react well when seniors start asserting independence. Daniel won't react well, I agreed. But I can't let that stop me. I've spent my entire life putting others' needs first. My students, my husband's, my children's. For once, I need to stand up for myself. Ray nodded thoughtfully. You know, there's a workshop next month at the community college on seniors' legal rights. I was thinking of arranging transportation for interested residents. Might be good. Timing. That's an excellent idea. Perhaps we could also invite a speaker here. Someone who could address the whole resident population. I love how you're always thinking about the wider community, Ray smiled. Most people in your situation would be focused solely on their own problems. His observation gave me pause. It was true that even as I dealt with my personal crisis, I found myself increasingly concerned about my fellow residents at Whispering Pines. How many others had been placed here against their will? How many were being financially exploited by family members? How many had simply given up fighting for their autonomy? Being a teacher for 40 years leaves its mark, I said finally. You start to see problems in terms of systemic solutions, not just individual cases. Well, consider me an ally in your systemic solutions, Ray offered. Within professional boundaries, of course. Of course. The rest of Monday passed without incident. The book club meeting exceeded my expectations, with 12 residents engaging in a spirited discussion of Ishiguro's novel. Even Eleanor, who had initially dismissed the club as pretentious nonsense, asked thoughtful questions about the protagonist's self-deception. Tuesday brought the first real test of my resolve. I was returning from the writing group where I'd shared a piece about Howard's belief in standing up for principles even when it was difficult, when I encountered Mrs. Simmons in the hallway. "Mrs. Foster, your son is here to see you. He's quite insistent." My heart rate accelerated, but I kept my expression neutral. "Is Ray available to supervise the visit?" "He's currently leading chair yoga in the East Wing. Nurse Wilson has offered to sit in instead." Denise Wilson was the night nurse who had checked on me that first evening, a kind woman with a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated. "That would be fine. Where is Daniel waiting?" "In the visitor's lounge. He's upset about the legal papers he received this morning." I imagine he is. Daniel was pacing when I entered, his normally well-groomed appearance slightly disheveled. He turned at the sound of the door, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Mom, what the hell is this?" He held up the legal documents, waving them like an accusation. "Revoking power of attorney? Petitioning the court about the house? Have you lost your mind?" "Hello, Daniel. This is Nurse Wilson. She'll be sitting in on our conversation today." He barely glanced at Denise. "Why do we need a nurse here? This is a private family matter. I requested supervision for our meetings until the legal issues are resolved," I explained, taking a seat in the armchair farthest from him. "Please sit down so we can discuss this calmly." "Calmly? You're suing me, your own son, and you want to talk calmly?" "I'm seeking accountability, not punishment," I corrected. "The house was sold without my knowledge, at well below market value, to a company your wife partially owns. Surely you can understand why that raises concerns." "It was a private sale to avoid realtor fees," he snapped. "And the price was fair considering the house needs updating." The price was $150,000 below comparable sales in the neighborhood. And not a penny of those proceeds seems to be benefiting me, given my accommodations here. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of Howard that it momentarily softened my resolve. "Mom, you don't understand the complexities involved, the financial arrangements, the trust structure." "Then explain them to me," I interrupted. "Show me the trust documents. Provide an accounting of where the money went. If everything was done properly, you should have no objection to transparency." His expression hardened. "This is Susan's doing, isn't it? She swoops in after years of minimal contact and suddenly she's your advocate? Where was she when you needed help after your fall? When you couldn't manage the house anymore?" "I could manage just fine," I corrected. "And Susan is here now, which is what matters. She's filling your head with legal nonsense because she wants a piece of the inheritance. That's all this is. A money grab." The accusation was so far from reality that it would have been laughable if it weren't so offensive. "Susan hasn't asked for a penny. She hired the attorney with her own money, and there won't be much inheritance left if you've spent it all." Daniel's face flushed. "You think I took your money after everything I've done for you?" "Everything you've done for me?" I repeated, incredulity rising. Daniel, I helped pay for your education. I co-signed your first home loan. I gave you money for the down payment on your current house. I invested in your business ventures. For years, I've been supporting you while depleting my own resources, and your response was to sell my home and place me in a budget care facility. We had no choice. You couldn't live alone anymore. That wasn't your decision to make. And you certainly had no right to sell my house to Victoria's family's company at a discount. Daniel fell silent, his jaw working as he struggled to formulate a response. Denise, who had been quietly observing, shifted slightly in her chair. "Mrs. Foster," she said gently, "your blood pressure medication is due soon. We should wrap up if this conversation is becoming too stressful." I was grateful for her intervention, though I suspected my blood pressure wasn't her primary concern. "You're right, Nurse Wilson. Daniel, unless you're prepared to provide full financial transparency, I think we should continue this discussion through our respective attorneys." "Attorneys?" he scoffed. "Do you have any idea what you're starting? The family discord? The legal fees? All because you couldn't accept that at your age, you needed help managing your affairs." "I needed help with certain physical tasks after my fall," I corrected. "Not with managing my finances or deciding where I would live. Those distinctions seem to have escaped you." Daniel stood abruptly. "This is a waste of time. You're clearly not thinking rationally. I'll have our family attorney contact yours. And don't expect Victoria or the kids to visit while you're pursuing this witch hunt. The last time Victoria visited was the day you left me here," I pointed out. "And the children haven't shown any interest in seeing their grandmother in months, so that's hardly a meaningful threat." He flinched as if I'd struck him. For a moment, I saw something flicker behind his anger. Shame, perhaps, or a glimpse of recognition that his behavior might be indefensible. But it vanished quickly, replaced by cold determination. "You'll regret this, Mom. When you're alone, here with no family support, when the legal bills eat up whatever money you think you're fighting for, you'll wish you had trusted me to handle things." With that parting shot, he stormed out, leaving Denise and me in startled silence. "Well," she said finally, "that went about as well as could be expected." A laugh escaped me, surprising us both. "Actually, it went better than I feared. He didn't try to have me declared incompetent on the spot." Denise smiled wryly. "Give him time. That's usually the next play when the intimidation fails." Her prediction proved unnervingly accurate. The following morning, I received a call from Judith Barnett. "Maggie, I wanted to give you a heads up. Daniel's attorney has contacted me indicating they plan to petition for guardianship, claiming you're not competent to manage your own affairs." The word sent a chill through me despite the morning sunshine streaming through the window. "On what grounds?" "They're suggesting your fall may have caused cognitive impairment that wasn't immediately apparent. They're also citing erratic behavior, including joining multiple new activities at Whispering Pines and turning against family without cause." "Joining activities is evidence of cognitive impairment?" I asked incredulously. "And standing up to financial exploitation is turning against family?" "It's a desperate move," Judith assured me, "but one we need to take seriously. I'm arranging for an independent neuropsychological evaluation to document your cognitive capacity. The good news is that your revocation of power of attorney was filed before their petition, which strengthens our position." After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed, hands trembling slightly. The legal maneuver wasn't unexpected, but the reality of my own son attempting to have me declared incompetent struck deeper than I'd anticipated. Was there no limit to what he would do to maintain control of my assets? I needed air. The walls of my shared room suddenly felt confining, as if closing in with each breath. Grabbing my cane, I made my way outside to the small courtyard where Irene and I often had our morning coffee. The November air was bracing, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and impending winter. I settled on a bench beneath the skeletal branches of a maple tree, its few remaining leaves clinging stubbornly despite the season's change. Incompetent. The word echoed in my mind, loaded with implications. In 40 years of teaching, I'd seen the damage labels could do to children. Now my own son was attempting to apply the most devastating label of all to me, a declaration that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions. "Penny for your thoughts?" came a familiar voice. I looked up to find Walter standing nearby, a steaming cup in each hand. He offered one to me with a gentle smile. "You looked like you could use this. They're serving that surprisingly decent coffee today instead of the usual dishwater." "Thank you," I said, accepting the cup gratefully. "How did you know I was out here?" "Ray mentioned you'd received an upsetting phone call and headed outside. I thought you might appreciate company, or solitude, if you prefer. I'm happy to leave you to your thoughts." I gestured to the empty space beside me. "Company would be welcome, actually." Walter sat, keeping a respectful distance on the bench. He didn't press for details about what had upset me, simply sat in companionable silence as we sipped our coffee. There was something profoundly comforting about his presence, undemanding yet steadfast. "My son is trying to have me declared incompetent," I finally said, the words tumbling out before I could reconsider, "to prevent me from challenging his control of my finances." Walter's expression remained calm, though I noticed his knuckles whiten slightly around his cup. "That must be deeply painful." "It is. More than I expected, to be honest. I understood he might fight the legal challenge, but to question my mental capacity." I trailed off, searching for words to describe the particular sting of this betrayal. "It's one of the cruelest weapons in the arsenal," Walter observed quietly. "Used far too often against seniors who dare to assert their autonomy." I glanced at him, surprised by his insight. "You sound like you've seen this before." "I have. Before I taught English literature, I practiced elder law for a decade. I switched careers after becoming disillusioned with the legal system's treatment of seniors." He smiled wryly. Poetry seemed more honest than jurisprudence in the end. "You're full of surprises, Professor Mitchell." "As are you, Mrs. Foster. Most people in your situation would retreat, overwhelmed by the specter of a competency hearing." "I'm not most people," I replied, surprised by the firmness in my voice. "And I won't be bullied, not even by my own son." Walter nodded approvingly. "Good. The petition itself is often the deterrent. The threat of public scrutiny, medical examinations, courtroom testimony. Many seniors drop their claims rather than endure the process." "Which is exactly what Daniel is counting on," I realized. "He thinks I'll back down rather than fight." "Will you?" "Not a chance," I said, without hesitation. "I spent 40 years teaching children to stand up for themselves. What kind of example would I be setting if I failed to do the same?" Walter chuckled. "I pity the opposing counsel who underestimates you." We sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching a chickadee flit between the bare branches overhead. The small creature's determined activity despite the approaching winter seemed suddenly symbolic of my own situation. "You know," Walter said thoughtfully, "there's a poem by Mary Oliver that reminds me of you, The Journey. It begins, 'One day you finally knew what you had to do and began.' I don't know it," I admitted. "It's about finding the courage to save your own life, even when others call you back. To follow your own voice when everyone else is shouting their terrible advice." His eyes met mine, warm with understanding. "It made me think of you the first time I heard you read in our writing group. That same quiet determination to reclaim yourself." Something shifted in my chest, a warming sensation that had nothing to do with the coffee I was drinking. "I'd like to read it sometime." "I'll bring you a copy tomorrow," he promised. Then, glancing at his watch, "But for now, I should head to the community room. I promised to help set up for the afternoon film screening." "What are they showing?" "On Golden Pond." Somewhat on the nose for this demographic, I'm afraid. I smiled despite myself. I've always liked that film. Clichés and all. Walter stood, hesitating slightly before adding, I'm happy to save you a seat if you'd like to join. The company would make it more enjoyable, at least for me. The invitation was casual, but the look in his eyes suggested it carried more weight than his tone implied. I found myself nodding. I'd like that, thank you. After Walter left, I remained in the courtyard a bit longer, gathering my thoughts before returning inside. The initial shock of Daniel's legal maneuver was fading, replaced by a cold, clear anger. He had miscalculated badly if he thought threatening. My competency would make me surrender. If anything, it strengthened my resolve to see this through to the end. When I returned to my room, Eleanor was watching a game show, the volume at its usual excessive level. She barely glanced my way as I entered, but as I hung up my cardigan, she surprised me by muting the television. Your son called, she said, her voice as raspy as ever. Said to tell you he's trying to reach you. Sounded upset. I imagine he is, I murmured. Family trouble? Eleanor asked, an unusual show of interest in something beyond her television programs. You could say that. She nodded, her thin lips pressed together. My daughter tried to sell my house too, after Earl died. Said it was too much for me to manage. What she meant was she wanted the money for that swimming pool her husband kept talking about. It was the most personal information Eleanor had, shared since I'd arrived. What did you do? Told her I'd report her to the police for elder abuse if she didn't back off. Haven't heard much from her since. She shrugged, a gesture that seemed to encompass both regret and defiance. Sometimes, family isn't what we think it is. With that philosophical observation, she turned the volume back up, effectively ending our brief moment of connection. But something had shifted between us, a subtle acknowledgement of shared experience that hadn't existed before. I checked my phone and found 3 missed calls from Daniel, but no messages. Whatever he wanted to say, he apparently couldn't bring himself to leave it on voicemail. I decided not to return the calls. Any communication now should go through our respective attorneys. Susan called at noon, as she had each day since returning to Portland. Mom, Judith told me about Daniel's petition. Are you okay? I'm angry, I admitted. But not surprised. It's a classic tactic when someone feels cornered. That doesn't make it any less despicable, Susan said, her voice tight with controlled fury. To suggest you're incompetent because you're exercising your legal rights? It's beyond outrageous. Judith is arranging for a neuropsychological evaluation to counter his claims. I'm not worried about the outcome. Still, the stress of going through it. I'm booking a flight back for next week. I want to be there for the hearing. You don't need to disrupt your work schedule again, Susan. It's not a disruption. It's a priority. Her tone brooked no argument. Besides, I've been thinking about taking a leave of absence anyway. This situation with Daniel has made me realize how precious time with you is, and how little of it I've prioritized these past few years. The sincerity in her voice brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I'd love to have you here, I said simply. After our call, I joined Walter for the film screening as planned. The community room had been transformed into a makeshift theater, with chairs arranged in rows and the lights dimmed. Walter had indeed saved me a seat, with Irene and Frank positioned strategically nearby. Heard your son is pulling the "my mother's crazy" card, Irene whispered as I settled in. Classic move from a desperate man. Word travels fast, I observed, not particularly surprised that news of Daniel's petition had already circulated. No secrets in a place this size, Frank agreed, except maybe what they actually put in the Tuesday meatloaf. The film began, silencing further conversation. I found myself unexpectedly moved by the story of aging, reconciliation, and the bitter realization of mortality. Beside me, Walter occasionally glanced my way during particularly resonant scenes, a silent acknowledgement of the parallels to real life. When the lights came up, many residents had damp eyes, though most would likely deny it if asked. The film had struck a collective nerve in a room full of people confronting their own Golden Pond years, many without the family reconciliation the movie offered. "Well, that was a real upper," Frank commented, though his usual sarcasm seemed somewhat muted. "I thought it was beautiful," Dorothy countered. "Honest about aging without being maudlin." "What did you think, Maggie?" Walter asked. I considered my answer carefully. "I think it presents a comforting fantasy that family ruptures can heal. That understanding can triumph over hurt. Reality is messier, less satisfying, but perhaps that's why we need stories like this, to show us what's possible even if it's not probable." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "The best art doesn't offer easy answers, just better questions." As the group dispersed, Walter walked with me toward the dining hall for the evening meal. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said. "Specifically, about Daniel's competency challenge." "What about it?" "It might be useful to gather character references, statements from people who interact with you regularly attesting to your clear cognitive functioning. As a former lawyer, I'd be happy to draft something, as would Ray, I imagine. Perhaps even Dr. Phillips from the medical staff." The offer touched me deeply. "That's very thoughtful, Walter. I'll mention it to Judith." "Good. The more evidence of your competence, the harder it will be for Daniel to sustain his petition." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I hope you know you have allies here, Maggie. People who see you clearly and value your strength." There was something in his expression, an intensity, a personal investment beyond professional courtesy, that sent a flutter through my chest. It had been years since I'd felt that particular sensation, not since the early days with Howard when a look or a word could quicken my pulse. "Thank you," I managed, suddenly feeling unaccountably shy. "That means a great deal to me." Before Walter could respond, Ray approached us with an apologetic expression. "Sorry to interrupt, but Mrs. Simmons would like to see you in her office, Maggie. Says it's urgent." I exchanged a glance with Walter, who squeezed my arm reassuringly. "I'll save you a seat for dinner if you're not too long." Mrs. Simmons was on the phone when I entered her office, but quickly ended the call. She gestured for me to take a seat, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Foster, I've received some concerning information that I need to discuss with you." Here it comes, I thought. Daniel's competency challenge had reached the administration. "What sort of information?" "Your daughter-in-law, Victoria, called to inform us that there may be changes to your financial arrangements. Specifically, she mentioned the trust that pays for your care here might be frozen due to legal proceedings." This wasn't what I had expected. "I see. While we understand family disputes can be complicated, Whispering Pines requires timely payment for services rendered. If there's going to be an interruption in your ability to pay, we need to discuss alternatives." The implication was clear. No money, no bed. "My attorney is handling the financial aspects," I said carefully. "But I assure you, payment for my care is a top priority. The legal action is specifically aimed at ensuring my assets are properly managed for my benefit, not diverted elsewhere." Mrs. Simmons nodded, though her expression remained skeptical. "Be that as it may, we operate on tight margins. We can't afford to provide services without compensation while legal issues are resolved. That could take months." "I understand," I said, thinking quickly. "Would it help if I had my attorney contact you directly to discuss interim payment arrangements? That would be appreciated." She hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Foster, I should also inform you that we've received notification of a competency evaluation request for you, filed by your son." I maintained a neutral expression despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Yes, I'm aware. It's a retaliatory measure in response to my legal action regarding my house and finances." We're required to cooperate with such evaluations, she continued. Dr. Phillips will conduct an initial assessment tomorrow morning. That's fine. I have nothing to hide and no reason to fear an objective evaluation of my cognitive function. Mrs. Simmons studied me with new interest, perhaps surprised by my calm acceptance of the situation. Most residents find these evaluations distressing. I spent 40 years administering and grading tests, Mrs. Simmons. One more won't bother me, especially when I know the correct answers. My dry response seemed to catch her off guard. She cleared her throat. Well, that's a healthy attitude, I suppose. As I stood to leave, a thought occurred to me. Mrs. Simmons, has Victoria made these types of calls before? About my financial arrangements, I mean. I'm not at liberty to discuss specific communications, she replied automatically. I understand, but as the subject of those communications, I believe I have a right to know if decisions about my care are being influenced by information I'm not privy to. She hesitated, ethical considerations visibly warring with administrative pragmatism. Your daughter-in-law has been our primary contact regarding your financial matters since your arrival. That's not unusual when family members manage a resident's affairs. And what exactly has she told you about my financial situation? Another pause. That your care was being funded by a trust with limited resources, requiring careful management to ensure long-term coverage. Limited resources, I repeated. From the sale of a house worth over $600,000. Interesting. Mrs. Simmons shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Foster, I don't wish to be caught in the middle of a family disagreement. No one does. But you already are, I'm afraid. Victoria and Daniel have been managing my narrative since before I arrived, presenting me as someone with minimal assets requiring minimal care. But the truth is quite different, and I intend to prove that through the legal system. I left her office with my back straight and my head high, aware that our conversation likely represented a turning point in how the administration perceived me. No longer just another compliant resident, I had become a potential complication. Someone demanding accountability, not just from family, but potentially from the facility itself. Walter was waiting at our usual table when I arrived in the dining hall, a place now saved for me as routinely as Irene saved my coffee spot in the courtyard. These small courtesies, these acknowledgments of my personhood and belonging, had become precious to me in ways I couldn't articulate. Everything all right? He asked as I settled into my seat. Victoria called the administration to warn them. My care payments might be interrupted due to the legal proceedings, I explained. A clear attempt to pressure me through fear of losing my place here. That's despicable, Dorothy said from across the table. Using your basic security as leverage. Technically, she's not wrong, I admitted. If the trust is frozen during legal proceedings, it could affect payments. But it's a problem my attorney can address. It didn't require Victoria's intervention. Unless creating anxiety was precisely the point, Walter observed. The more stressed you become, the more susceptible you might appear during cognitive testing. The strategy was so coldly calculated that it momentarily stole my breath. You think they're trying to affect the results of my competency evaluation? I think they're leveraging every advantage they can, ethical or not, Walter replied. Elder law cases often become wars of attrition. Whoever can withstand the emotional toll longest often prevails, regardless of legal merit. Then they've severely underestimated me, I said, picking up my fork with renewed determination. I taught middle school during the energy crisis of the 70s. I know how to function under pressure. Frank chuckled. Never mess with a teacher. They've seen it all and still show up the next day. The following morning, Dr. Phillips arrived promptly at 9 for my cognitive assessment. A gentle-mannered physician in his 50s, he had always treated me with respect during routine checkups, addressing his questions to me rather than to staff as some doctors did with older patients. Mrs. Foster, he greeted me, setting his clipboard on the small table in my room. Eleanor had been temporarily relocated to the community room for social hour, a transparent excuse to provide privacy for the evaluation. I understand you're aware of why I'm here today. My son believes I've lost my marbles because I'm challenging his control of my finances, I replied dryly. You're here to determine if that's true. A smile flickered across his face before he composed his expression into professional neutrality. I'm here to conduct a standard cognitive assessment, yes, the mini mental state examination, and a few additional evaluative tools. Nothing invasive or trick questions. I appreciate your directness, doctor. Let's proceed. The examination was, indeed, straightforward. Questions about orientation to time and place, short-term memory exercises, simple calculations, language skills, and basic reasoning. I approached each task methodically, as I might a professional development assessment during my teaching years. Excellent, Dr. Phillips said as we completed the final section. That concludes the formal evaluation. And? I prompted. He raised an eyebrow. You know I can't discuss the results directly with you, Mrs. Foster. My report will be submitted to the requesting physician and the court. Of course, professional protocol. Dr. Phillips began gathering his materials, then paused. Off the record, Mrs. Foster, I've conducted hundreds of these evaluations. Patients with genuine cognitive impairment typically don't challenge the process or understand why it's happening. They certainly don't approach it with your level of metacognition. It wasn't an explicit confirmation of my competence, but his meaning was clear enough. Thank you, doctor. That's reassuring to hear. I should also mention, he added, lowering his voice slightly, that a neuropsychologist named Dr. Elena Kapoor called to schedule a more comprehensive evaluation with you tomorrow. She mentioned she's being retained by your attorney. Yes, for a second opinion. Standard procedure in these cases, I'm told. He nodded. Dr. Kapoor is excellent. Very thorough, very fair-minded. You'll be in good hands. After he left, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The first hurdle had been cleared. Dr. Phillips might not have shared his conclusions explicitly, but his manner suggested my performance had been strong. One small victory in what promised to be a protracted battle. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine activities. Lunch with my now established group of friends, the book club meeting where we selected our next novel, Jane Austen's Persuasion, a choice that prompted knowing smiles from both Walter and Dorothy, and a surprisingly competitive game of Scrabble that Frank won with the strategic placement of quixotic on a triple-word score. Throughout these normal interactions, I was acutely aware of being watched, not just by other residents who had inevitably heard rumors about my family conflict, but by staff members who seemed to be paying particular attention to my behavior, my responses, my overall demeanor. Every conversation felt like potential evidence, every decision a data point in the ongoing assessment of my competence. It was exhausting, this constant awareness of being evaluated. By evening, I retreated to my room earlier than usual, genuinely fatigued by the emotional vigilance the day had required. I was surprised to find Eleanor absent, a note on her bed explaining she was attending the evening movie screening, something she rarely did, preferring her television programs. The unexpected privacy was welcome. I changed into my nightgown and settled into bed with the book of Mary Oliver poems Walter had brought me that morning as promised. The poem he had mentioned, The Journey, was marked with a small paper flag. I turned to it immediately, drawn to the lines he had quoted in our conversation. As I read, a profound sense of recognition washed over me. The poem spoke of determination in the face of others calling you back, of saving the only life you could save, your own. It was as if Oliver had somehow reached across time and space to articulate exactly what I was experiencing. I was still pondering the poem when my phone rang. Susan's name flashed on the screen. I just got off the phone with Judith, she said without preamble. The court date is set for next Wednesday. Can you hold on until then? Of course I can. I'm not the one panicking. Daniel is. Victoria called James, she continued, referring to her husband. Tried to get him to talk some sense into me about supporting your delusional claims. Her words, not mine. What did James say? That he fully supports my decision to ensure my mother's financial autonomy and that Victoria might want to consider why she's so invested in controlling your assets. Susan's voice held a note of pride in her husband's response. She hung up on him. They're getting desperate, I observed. Victoria called the nursing home administration today, hinting that payments for my care might be interrupted due to legal proceedings. That's a new low, even for her. Susan sounded genuinely shocked. Threatening your housing security to force compliance? Judith needs to know about this immediately. I've already informed her. She's arranging interim payment solutions to ensure there's no interruption in my care. Good. And the competency evaluation? How did that go? Fine, I think. Dr. Phillips was professional and straightforward. The neuropsychologist your attorney arranged is coming tomorrow for a more thorough assessment. Judith believes the competency challenge is their weakest move, Susan said. It looks retaliatory and desperate, especially given the timing. But it's still stressful to endure. I've faced worse, I assured her, though in truth, the constant scrutiny was wearing on me more than I wanted to admit. How are you holding up through all this? Me? I'm not the one being challenged. No, but you've been thrown into a legal battle with your brother, who I assume isn't speaking to you now. Susan sighed. He sent a text accusing me of manipulating you for financial gain. I didn't dignify it with a response. I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this, I said quietly. It wasn't my intention to create a permanent rift between you two. Mom, listen to me. You didn't create this situation. Daniel did, with his actions and choices. I'm not caught in the middle. I'm standing firmly on the side of what's right. If Daniel can't see that, it's his problem, not yours. Her fierce loyalty brought tears to my eyes. Thank you for that. No thanks necessary. Get some rest. You have another evaluation tomorrow, and we need you sharp. After we hung up, I returned to the poetry book, finding solace in Oliver's clear-eyed observations about nature, purpose, and the courage required to live authentically. I read until my eyes grew heavy, finally setting the book aside and turning out the light. In the darkness, I thought about the journey ahead, the court hearing, the ongoing legal battle, the eventual resolution, whatever it might be. I thought about Daniel and Victoria, about what might have driven them to such extremes. Financial desperation, simple greed, or something more complex. Perhaps Daniel's resentment of having relied on my support for so long, a twisted need to assert control, as compensation for feelings of dependency? I would likely never know the full truth. But as I drifted toward sleep, I realized it didn't matter. Understanding their motivations wouldn't change what I needed to do now. Stand firm, speak truth, and reclaim what was rightfully mine. Not just my financial assets, but my autonomy, my dignity, my right to determine the shape of my remaining years. The last thought before sleep claimed me was of Walter's gentle encouragement, Susan's fierce advocacy, Irene's practical wisdom, and the unlikely community I had found in this place I had so resented upon arrival. Whatever happened in court, whatever resolution the legal system provided, I was no longer alone. And that, perhaps, was the most profound change of all. The morning of the court hearing dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline November day that seems to sharpen every edge and clarify every shadow. I dressed with particular care, a navy blue suit I'd insisted on bringing to Whispering Pines despite its impracticality in my daily life there. A silver brooch Howard had given me on our 35th anniversary, small pearl earrings that had been my mother's. Armor of a sort, these tangible connections to my past self, my identity beyond resident of room 218. Susan arrived early, bringing with her not just Judith, but also a travel cup of real coffee. "Contraband," she whispered as she handed it to me. "You deserve better than institutional brew today." Dr. Kapoor's comprehensive evaluation had gone well the previous week, her report confirming what Dr. Phillips had already documented. My cognitive functions were intact, my decision-making capacity unimpaired. The medical evidence would be presented alongside character statements from Walter, Ray, and several other Whispering Pines staff members who had stepped forward, despite the potential awkwardness of contradicting a resident's family. "Nervous?" Susan asked as we waited for Judith to bring the car around. "Strangely, no," I replied, realizing it was true. "I know what's right. The rest is just procedure." The county courthouse was an imposing limestone building that had intimidated me as a young teacher, when I'd occasionally been called to testify in student welfare cases. Now, walking up those same steps with Susan beside me and Judith ahead, I felt a calm resolve that surprised me. The hearing was scheduled for Judge Amelia Hernandez's courtroom, a stroke of luck, according to Judith, who described the judge as particularly attentive to elder rights issues. We settled at our table, Judith efficiently arranging documents, while I scanned the room for Daniel. He arrived moments before the scheduled start time, Victoria at his side, both dressed as if for a corporate board meeting. Their attorney, a silver-haired man with an expensive suit and perpetually furrowed brow, leaned in to whisper something that made Daniel nod tensely. Neither my son nor his wife looked in my direction. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Amelia Hernandez, presiding. The judge, a composed woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, entered and quickly established the parameters of the hearing. This would not be a full trial, but rather a preliminary proceeding to determine if Daniel's guardianship petition had merit and to address my challenge to his use of the power of attorney in selling my home. "I've reviewed the filings from both parties," she began, including the medical evaluations and character statements. "What concerns me most immediately is the timing of these actions. Mr. Foster, you sold your mother's home while she was hospitalized, then sought guardianship only after she challenged that sale legally. This sequence raises significant questions about motivation." Daniel's attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client acted in good faith to ensure his mother's care needs were met. The house sale provided necessary funds for that purpose. The guardianship petition was filed only when it became clear Mrs. Foster might be influenced by outside parties with financial interests." "That would be me, apparently," Susan whispered, rolling her eyes, "and making decisions contrary to her own best interests," the attorney concluded. Judge Hernandez turned to Judith. "And your response, counselor?" "The evidence clearly shows my client is cognitively intact and fully capable of making her own decisions. The house sale was executed without her knowledge while she was temporarily physically incapacitated, not mentally compromised. Furthermore, the property was sold significantly below market value to a company in which Mr. Foster's wife has a financial stake, a clear conflict of interest." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Foster, would you like to address the court directly?" I hadn't expected this opportunity, but rose steadily to my feet. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to clarify something important. This case isn't primarily about money, though financial exploitation is certainly involved. It's about autonomy. It's about whether someone who reaches a certain age automatically forfeits their right to self-determination." I paused, gathering my thoughts. I taught 4th grade for 40 years. During that time, I instilled in my students the importance of speaking up for themselves, of recognizing their own worth. What kind of example would I be setting if I failed to do the same when my own rights were violated? My son sold my home, my largest asset, without my knowledge or consent, to a company his wife partially owns, at a price well below market value. When I challenged this legally, he responded by attempting to have me declared incompetent. Judge Hernandez nodded encouragingly. Continue, Mrs. Foster. Every day in America, older people like me are discarded, placed in facilities without consultation, separated from their possessions, stripped of their financial autonomy, all under the guise of care. We're expected to be grateful for whatever attention our families deign to provide, never questioning, never objecting, because the alternative is complete abandonment. I looked directly at Daniel for the first time. I refuse to accept those terms. I refuse to be grateful for exploitation, disguised as concern. I refuse to surrender my voice or my choices simply because I've reached a certain age. I raised my son to recognize right from wrong. It's unfortunate that I now have to remind him of that lesson through legal means, but I will not apologize for standing up for myself. The courtroom was silent when I finished. Judge Hernandez regarded me thoughtfully before turning to Daniel. Mr. Foster, would you like to respond? Daniel stood, his posture rigid. Your Honor, my mother has always been strong-willed and independent. These are qualities I've always admired. But after her fall, it became clear she could no longer manage independently. The house required maintenance she couldn't oversee. The stairs presented a safety hazard. These concerns, combined with her need for daily assistance, made the sale a necessity, not an exploitation. And the below-market sale price to your wife's company? The judge inquired. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. The housing market is complex. The price reflected necessary renovations and the advantage of a quick cash sale. Judge Hernandez's expression suggested she found this explanation lacking. She continued questioning both sides for another hour, diving into financial details, timelines, and the specifics of the trust Daniel had established with the proceeds from my house sale. As the hearing progressed, a picture emerged that even I hadn't fully grasped: the extent to which Daniel had systematically diverted my assets to support his family's lifestyle while providing me with minimal care. The trust, ostensibly created for my benefit, had been structured to allow him broad discretion in its management, with only a fraction of the funds actually designated for my care at Whispering Pines. Finally, Judge Hernandez called a brief recess to review her notes. As she left the courtroom, I noticed Victoria leaning in to whisper urgently to Daniel, her expression anxious. Their attorney seemed to be tempering expectations, his hands making calming gestures as he spoke. "It's going well," Judith murmured to Susan and me. The judge is clearly troubled by the financial arrangements and the conflict of interest in the house sale. When Judge Hernandez returned, her expression was composed but resolute. Having reviewed the evidence presented today, I'm prepared to issue a preliminary ruling. First, regarding the guardianship petition, I find no credible evidence of cognitive impairment or incapacity that would justify removing Mrs. Foster's decision-making authority. Multiple medical evaluations confirm her competence. The petition appears retaliatory rather than motivated by genuine concern. It is therefore denied. A wash of relief flowed through me, though I maintained my composed exterior. Second, regarding the house sale. There are significant concerns about Mr. Foster's use of the power of attorney in this transaction. The below-market sale to a company with family connections represents, at minimum, a conflict of interest and potentially a breach of fiduciary duty. I am therefore freezing the remaining proceeds from the sale and ordering a full accounting of all funds derived from Mrs. Foster's assets over the past 5 years. Daniel's face had gone pale. Victoria clutched his arm, her knuckles white. Finally, I am revoking Mr. Foster's power of attorney effective immediately. Mrs. Foster may designate a new representative of her choosing or manage her affairs independently if she prefers. The judge looked directly at me. Mrs. Foster, do you have a preference in this matter? I would like to designate my daughter, Susan Parker, as my power of attorney should it become necessary in the future, Your Honor. For now, I prefer to manage my own affairs. Judge Hernandez nodded. So ordered. We will reconvene in 30 days to review the financial accounting and determine appropriate remedies regarding the house sale. Court is adjourned. The tap of her gavel seemed to release something that had been coiled tightly inside me for months. It wasn't a complete victory. The house was still sold, the legal process far from over. But it was vindication. Official. Acknowledgement that I had been wronged. That my autonomy mattered. That I deserved better than what my son had arranged for me. As we gathered our belongings, Daniel approached our table, his expression an uncomfortable mixture of anger and uncertainty. Mom, any communication should go through our attorneys, Daniel, I interrupted, my tone firm but not unkind. I think that's best for now. He looked as if he wanted to say more, but Victoria tugged at his arm, steering him toward the exit where their attorney waited. The last glimpse I had of my son that day was his back as he walked away, shoulders slumped in a posture that suggested he was only beginning to grasp the consequences of his actions. Outside the courthouse, Susan hugged me tightly. You were magnificent in there. Dad would have been so proud. He would have been heartbroken about Daniel, I said quietly. Yes, she acknowledged, but incredibly proud of you for standing up for yourself. That's what matters today. 6 months later, on a warm spring afternoon, I sat in the small garden of my new apartment at Riverside Meadows, a senior living community that offered independent living with graduated care options as needed. The settlement from the legal proceedings had provided sufficient funds to secure my spot here. A private one-bedroom apartment with a kitchenette, access to communal dining when I preferred company, and medical assistance available if required. It wasn't my house on Maple Avenue. Nothing could replace the home where I'd raised my family, where Howard and I had built our life together. But it was mine, a space I had chosen, furnished with the personal items Susan had managed to recover from storage, decorated according to my preferences rather than institutional standards. The garden was blooming with late spring flowers, a riot of color and scent that reminded me of the yard Howard had so lovingly tended. I was reading poetry, which had become a daily pleasure since Walter had introduced me to Mary Oliver's work, when a familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. The secret to enjoying poetry outdoors is a comfortable chair and adequate shade, Walter observed, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. You seem to have mastered both. Years of reading to squirming 4th graders taught me the importance of proper seating, I replied, accepting the coffee with a smile. Walter had become a regular visitor since my move to Riverside Meadows 3 months ago. What had begun as friendly support during my legal battle had gradually evolved into something deeper, a connection based on mutual respect, shared interests, and the particular understanding that comes from 2 people who have experienced both loss and resilience. How was your class this morning? I asked as he settled into the adjacent chair. Enthusiastic, if not entirely grammatical, he replied with a chuckle. Teaching creative writing to seniors is rewarding precisely because they care about the content more than the rules. I'd encouraged Walter to approach Riverdale Community College about offering a creative writing course specifically for seniors, an idea that had blossomed into a popular program now in its 2nd session. I occasionally joined as a guest, sharing pieces from the writing practice I'd begun at Whispering Pines and continued more seriously here. Susan called earlier, I said, changing the subject. She's coming for a week next month, bringing James. This time, she wants to take us to that new restaurant by the river. Us? Walter's eyebrow rose slightly. I may have mentioned you've been a regular visitor, I admitted. She seems quite interested in meeting the man who's been bringing her mother poetry and premium coffee. Walter smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling in the way that had become so endearingly familiar. I'd be delighted to meet her. From everything you've said, she's quite remarkable. She is, I agreed. The legal battle changed our relationship, deepened it. We talk several times a week now, not just about practical matters, but really talk. I've learned more about her life, her work, her marriage in these past months than in the previous decade. And Daniel, Walter asked gently. I sighed, setting my coffee aside. Still complicated. The financial settlement forced a level of accountability he'd avoided for years. According to Susan, he and Victoria are selling their house, downsizing, to something more aligned with their actual means now that my funds aren't supplementing their lifestyle. The grandchildren email occasionally, which is a start. Do you think there's hope for reconciliation eventually? Perhaps. Not the same relationship we had before. That's gone. But something new might be possible, with clear boundaries and expectations on both sides. I shrugged slightly. Time will tell. I'm not closing any doors, but I'm not waiting by them either. Walter nodded understandingly. A wise approach. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our coffee, and watching a pair of cardinals flit between the flowering bushes. At 73, I had learned that such moments of peaceful companionship were precious gifts, not to be taken for granted or rushed through. I've been thinking, Walter said eventually. The community theater is doing Our Town next month. Would you be interested in attending with me? Perhaps dinner beforehand? That sounds lovely, I replied, noting the slight relief in his expression. After 6 months of coffee, shared meals, and increasingly personal conversations, we were still navigating the delicate terrain of courtship in our 70s, both carrying histories, both cautious about new attachments, both surprised by the possibility of connection at this stage of life. Excellent. It's a date then. His hand found mine on the armrest between us, a gentle pressure that conveyed affection without demand. Later that afternoon, I had a video call scheduled with Irene and Frank, who remained at Whispering Pines, but had become regular correspondents since my departure. Dorothy had moved to be closer to her son in Vancouver after what she described as a long overdue honest conversation about their relationship, inspired partly by my example. The new activities director is a disaster, Irene reported, her face animated on my tablet screen. Thinks chair yoga and bingo are the height of entertainment. Nothing like what Ray did. Ray set a high standard, I agreed. How's the resident council working out? Frank's face appeared, crowding into the frame beside Irene. Making progress inch by painful inch. We got them to extend visiting hours and improve the weekend meal options. Small victories. Those small victories matter, I reminded him. They're the building blocks of dignity. After our call, I opened my laptop to work on the opinion piece I was writing for the local newspaper, a reflection on elder autonomy and the systemic challenges seniors face in maintaining independence. It had grown from a personal essay into something broader, incorporating research on elder rights and interviews with other seniors who had experienced similar challenges with family members or care institutions. The writing had become a purpose beyond my personal case, a way to channel my experience into advocacy that might help others. Local senior groups had invited me to speak, sharing both my story and practical advice for protecting one's autonomy. Each time I stood before these groups, I thought of all the quiet voices in places like Whispering Pines, people with rich histories and valuable perspectives, too often reduced to their care needs rather than recognized as full human beings, with continuing contributions to make. As evening approached, I prepared a simple dinner in my kitchenette. The ability to cook for myself again was a luxury I deeply appreciated, and settled at my small dining table with a glass of wine and the novel my book club was currently discussing. The independence of this routine, the freedom to eat when and what I wanted, to stay up reading as late as I pleased, to structure my days according to my own rhythms. These simple dignities had taken on profound significance after their temporary loss. My phone chimed with a text message from Susan. Just booked flights for next month. Can't wait to see your new place in person and meet this Walter you keep mentioning. Love you. I smiled, sending back a quick reply before returning to my novel. The path that had brought me here, from the shock of finding myself deposited at Whispering Pines to the present moment of hard-won independence, had been neither straight nor easy. It had required courage I hadn't known I possessed, allies I couldn't have anticipated, and a willingness to fight systems designed to manage rather than empower people my age. But sitting in my own space, surrounded by my own things, engaged, in work that mattered, connected to people who valued me as a complete human being rather than a burden to be managed, I knew with absolute certainty that the struggle had been worth it. That one phone call from Susan, arriving when I was at my lowest point, had indeed changed everything. Not because she had rescued me, but because it had awakened my determination to rescue myself. As the evening light softened into dusk, I found myself returning to the Mary Oliver poem Walter had shared during those dark days at Whispering Pines. The final lines had become a personal manifesto of sorts, a reminder of the journey I had undertaken and continued to pursue each day. Determined to save the only life you could save. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.